Hello, my name is Vadim. In this video I will tell you about another one of my assets. I created to speed up and simplify the process of creating shooting scene in videos or games with various hit effects. As an introduction, I will discuss the features and capabilities of the asset. Then I will explain its parameter and functionality with some basic examples. And finally, I will show you its application in a real scene. The asset moves points along predefined trajectories. Trajectories can be set in different ways, one of which is the camera view. In the first-person view, you can add point by clicking in the viewport, which simultaneously creates trajectories for them. This is somewhat similar to a first-person shooter game. The trajectory calculation occurs from the camera position to the click position. When a point collides with any polygonal object, it leaves a mark on it, meaning point and primitive with certain attributes are created. I will now demonstrate this with a simpler example. It is important that the polygonal object used with the asset have a closed structure. This ensures that when a moving point collides with such an object, it creates a primitive inside it that follows the movement trajectory of the point within that object. Additionally, special points are created on the entry and exit of the object, which are added a specific group for easier identification and use. These points have IDs that match the moving point that create them. Each primitive created in any object also has a unique ID, which includes the ID of the point that created it, and a specific unique value to help you identify it. This is useful if you want to use each primitive separately, color them differently, or apply effects to each primitive in duality. The created points and primitives inherit all transformation of the object they were created on. This means they stick on the object, so if it continues to move, the created points and primitive will also move with it. The entry indexing point has specified attribute to simplify the addition of effects emitters, such as smoke, water, fire, or glow. You can set different effects for each object individually. The asset handles a wide range of situations involving animated objects or simulations, such as partial penetrations through multiple objects in one step. For example, one object might be passed while the moving point is inside another, and in the next frame it exists and creates a point. No matter how long the point moves inside the object, it will eventually finish the primitive and the exit point to the group and assign the appropriate ID. Another situation is when a moving point is ahead of a large object. In this frame, the point has already crossed the plane of this primitive, and in the next, it is behind the object. Therefore, the entry point position is calculated along an oblique trajectory, and a primitive is created along this trajectory. You can additionally control the distance from the exit point to the object's corner and from the entry point to the corner if you need to create a unique effect. I will explain this in more detail when discuss the asset's parameters. The next situation involves oblique trajectory and several objects. Here the two objects are moving and one of created primitive forms oblique trajectory. Everything worked correctly as expected. Let's add a few more points to make this more interactive. You can see that all the created points inherit the transformations of the objects they were created on. The asset also supports ricochet effects, which occur when a moving point bounces off polygons if the angle of incidence is sharp enough. The ricochet parameters, including the bounce angle at the angle at which the ricochet effect triggers, can be adjusted as needed. At the ricochet position, a point is created, entering a special group with an attribute indicating the bouncing direction to apply effect modifications, like sparks. This makes the effect more realistic. The ricochet effect accounts for all collisions in one step and can be applied multiple times. For instance, within one step, a ricochet may occur several places. If an object on the moving point path has an angle that doesn't meet the parameter values, it will be considered passed, and the corresponding primitive and entry and exit points will be created. You can exclude certain objects from ricochet calculations using a special attribute. For example, if you don't want ricochets of paper or fabric, you can set this attribute in the settings. You can also disable the ricochet effect completely if it is not needed. The asset works with animated geometry, including packet and simulated geometry. When working with fragmented geometry, internal polygons are not considered in ricochet calculations. A special setting allows you to exclude these polygons from effect emitter points so that effects are created only on the outer polygons of the object. This ensures that the fragments move apart to a controllable distance. Their polygons become available for creating emitter points. Useful for BD simulations where an object starts to break apart, enhancing realism. Internal parts exposed to direct collision or freefall will also have points for effect attachment, improving both realism and computational efficiency. This is not all the asset can work with. Here is a test setup I assembled during my work on this asset. I tested the main scenarios on it, but much more complex cases arise when applying the asset to simulations like RBD or fluid simulations. For example, one of the common problems. I'll run the simulation now. Is as follows. I seem to have forgotten to disable the sparks. When a moving point collides with packet geometry involved in the simulation, it affects it with a velocity. This is shown here by color, action on a certain radius with a certain stretch. You can control this now. This might not be the best example after all. The object should be larger, or there should be more sub-steps. When in the first frame, a moving point ends up inside a large object. It shifts the fragments so that with low collision settings, the fragments end up inside each other, with their polygons often intersecting. This causes a series of unusual situations that are often quite difficult to handle. The asset can work with this, allowing you to save computational resources and work with standard or low collision settings. My computer is very old, Intel i3 with only 24 gigs of memory. The main resources consumption come from the dop network simulation, not asset. In this example, the points move endlessly without any stop, but the asset allows you to set configurations where you can control the distance each point travels inside an object. For example, you set 0.5, and if the point traveled a distance of 0.5 inside an object, the point will be stopped. The point stops and creates only entry points in the object. No exit points is created. The point itself remains as an exit point and is added to a special group so that it can be identified, used separately, or removed from the simulation if it necessary. The asset provides for working with the polygon source node to add explosion sources at impact points. Oh, that will be too hard. And since the simulation happens in real time, you can interact with these broken off pieces in real time as well. I think I'll conclude the introductory part with the description here and move to a more detailed review of the asset functionality and presets, allowing you to quickly create and customize effect emitters. Before diving into the parameters, I would like to explain how to use this asset. The main asset is called Simshot, where all the main calculations take place. Its outputs are the moving points and the points created during collisions, primitives, and the force with which the asset interacts with the simulation. An additional asset accompanies the main one, which is convenient for placing points and creating trajectories by clicking the mouse in the viewport. The main asset also has some similar functionality, but it is more limited compared to the additional asset. The asset works with packed and unpacked geometry. Unpacked geometry should have a primitive or detailed attributics form with 4x4 transformation matrix. Packed geometry should be compatible with the Vex function getPacketTransform, which the asset uses to retrieve the transformation matrix. Usually, these are a result of simulation or pre-packed geometry. Oh, sorry, of course, packed geometry. It would also be good if object had a velocity attribute. This is needed for calculation various oblique trajectories, essentially when collisions occur with fast-moving or any moving objects. There is also the well-known assemble node for object identification. This way the asset gets information about which objects it is colliding with. Essentially, there are only two mandatory attributes, but I recommend always adding velocity to the incoming geometry. The first input of the asset receives emitter points, which can be one or several. These points mark the starting positions for movement along the defined trajectory. The second input receives target points, which are the points that the additional HDA creates at the click positions on the viewport if you use camera view. When you click, a trajectory is calculated between the emitter point and the click position. There are the points that will move with the asset. The points provided to the second input must have certain attributes. Specifically, the points need at least two attributes, the emitter number and the speed. The emitter number indicates which emitter the point belongs to. For example, if you have several points emitters, they need to be identified by the emitter number. This number corresponds to the point number supplied to the first input. If you have 2 points and you want movement to start from both simultaneously along different trajectories, you need to assign half of the points in the second input to emitter 0 and the other half to emitter 1 and set their speed. Once you set the speed and it becomes greater than 0, the point starts moving. As recommended, to use the additional HDA for placing points. It will be good to create a separate review for additional HDA, but I'll cover the main parameter within this overview. To start using the asset, you need to select a camera. This will be the camera used for placing points by clicking the mouse in the viewport. The emitter position will be the camera position specified in this parameter, and it is output through the asset first output. Each asset can only have one emitter. If you need two or more emitters in a scene, you simply create another asset. Simplify different emitter. If the first one was 0, the next one will be 1. Combine them and feed them into the first input. The order of connections matter. If emitter 0 is specified here and emitter 1 is specified there, this HDA should be connected first because the emitter parameter is the index of the point connected to the first input of the main asset. Additionally, the asset has parameters such as start frame, which is the frame number for the beginning of point movement, and inactivity period, which is the pause between the start of point movement if you are not using the use timeline toggle. For example, you can place a certain number of points, start playback, and each of points will begin moving after this interval. Accordingly, if we set we start frame to 5 here, the initial frame for starting all points will be 5. Therefore, descending into the individual parameter of the points, we can see that our start frame always shifts by 3. That is, but the value specified in this parameter. To reset point parameters and start setting them anew, use the reset button. It won't work if the asset is not selected in the network view. To place points and perform actions on the asset, it must be selected in the network view. Once you've selected the asset, you can perform any actions with it. Resetting points, adding them again, resetting them again. Who watched my review of the previous asset noticed some similarity with the attached to asset. And indeed there is, but the functionality of these assets is different. The asset also has the ability to calculate trajectories based on two positions from 2 points. This is convenient for use if you have any trackers. You simply attach points to the trackers and at the desired frame anywhere, click on the viewport and add a point. Next, toggle direction correction is used if your emitter moves very fast. This is a feature of the asset operation. If the emitter moves quickly, and you place points of some geometric object and notice that the trajectory is not calculated quite correctly. Enable this toggle, check the box here, and most likely the problem will be solved. After you check the direction correction box, you need to go to the main Simshot asset and in the Targets tab, enable the start position attribute toggle. Then the main asset will understand that it will receive a special attribute indicating the starting position from point movement. I usually just link these two parameters together, so when you enable to toggle here, and that's pretty much all you need to know about the main parameters of additional HDA aim before starting war. Just add it to the network view, select the camera parameter, choose the camera, select show handle. If you have used timeline enable, start the timeline and begin placing points either on or off the object. During simulation, the asset detects collisions and produces points with special attributes to the first output. These attributes can be applied to apply certain effect emitters, primitives repeating the trajectory of movement within an object. The velocity for mainly simulation use. Probably the same geometry that was fed into the asset is output here, but already with a primitive attributics form and some difference if fragmented geometry is fed. I'll talk more about this later when I discuss the piece scaling toggle. Additionally, there's a fifth output here, which receives the visualization of the emitter point and the points you set using the built-in tool for setting target points in the main asset. All points are output to the first output. They are then separated into groups. Now let's consider the asset parameters. At the top, you can see the main parameters of any practical simulation. Simulation reset, initial frame, and number of substeps. The source tab contains two inactive parameters, emitter points and target points. They are inactive because they are already connected to input 1 and 2 of the main asset. We disable emitter points and this parameter become active. We can add some custom positions for emitter points here. Let's click Add, create a point in Add node and set point position as an relative position for the emitter point. Then perhaps we'll move it because it won't look very correct in the zero position. You may find this way of filling points much more interesting. It probably just differs from what I showed about the additional HDA. The same principle can essentially be applied to target points as well. That is, you can add some geometric shapes, curves, letters, anything on which point can be placed for trajectory calculation. Let's select a spiral now. A simple spiral made in Vex, with sine and cosine degrees, something like that, connected to target points, and since we don't have a velocity attribute on the points, and no one sets it, if we start the simulation, nothing will happen. So we go to the target tab, enable the toggle, set the initial simulation frame, set how many frames will be between the start of point movement, and just in case, we can reset it and start the simulation. We see that every 2 frames the point movement starts. These shapes might end up looking like small cones, because they are created at an angle. As you can see here, you can create strange shapes like this. You can achieve an intersection effect by using only the trail's output, adding something like a polywire and making this object glow. It will probably look quite nice. You can use your own methods to give the point speed and timing instead of using the built-in asset solution. To do this, simply disable the Enable Leading Points toggle and assign speed at the moments and frame you need. Let's go back to the Source tab. Here you can set the geometry type source. Currently SOP is selected. When you choose SOP, you just specify the path of the geometry source. You can also select SOP third context, which is the third input in the asset. This input only accepts SOP geometry. Additionally, you can supply DOP simulation result by selecting DOP. In this case, you choose the DOP network from which you want to pull simulation result and specify the object needed for collision calculations. For now, let's temporarily switch back to SOP. Attach an additional asset in its place and proceed to the Setup tab. The first parameter, piece attributes, refers to the name of the attribute with a unique value for each object, which this asset used to differentiate between objects. In this case, the assembly node assigns this attribute. As you can see, It creates an attribute named name with a unique value for each primitive. Currently we have only one object, so the attribute value is the same for all polygons of this object. If we had more objects, for example 2 objects, and we check this tab again, we should see P0 and P1, indicating the object identifier. The parameter is the asset specified the attribute name containing this identifier. Let's go back to the one object, make it visible. The next parameter, object size, represents the maximum size of the object you are using for collision calculation at its widest point. This is a technical parameter for optimization calculation efficiency. It works as follows. While a point moves within an object, it continuously checks if point is inside or has moved outside the object. Sometimes the object moves. For example, if a point is moving along a trajectory and finds itself in the middle of a cube, in the next frame it should be here. When the cube suddenly moves 20 meters to the right relative to the point's trajectory, the asset calculates the necessary adjustments and placing the exit point here. It creates a curved flight path inside the object and set the entry point there. This parameter essentially defines the distance to search for the object in which the point was moving. You can set this value very high, but since it relies on the intersect all function, it will be performed some unnecessary calculations. This won't significantly impact performance, but if you set a realistic value here, there will be fewer calculations. I plan to move this parameter under the hood in future version of the asset, but for now it is user configurably. The threshold parameter offsets the position to avoid self-intersection. If you have a highly layered material with layers very close together and the intersection isn't found with all layers, reduce this parameter until all intersections are detected. The transformation matrix delay parameter introduces a delay before applying the transformation matrix to points at the object's entry and exit. Let me show you how it works with an example. At another point, somewhere here, it should appear in the first frame. Select some geometry to create movement. Point created at the entry and exit start moving intermittently in the next frame. If you change the transform matrix delay value, specify the number of frames, for example 2, the asset will calculate accordingly in the next simulation. Notice the delay. Points start moving 2 frames after being created. This is useful in scene where a stationary laser beam cuts a moving object and sparks are generated at the contact point. Or in the other situation where an effect needs to linger at the contact point after the object moves. The default value is 1. Let's reset it to the default. The next parameter is group removal delay, which delay the removal of points from groups they are added to upon creation, such as the opt-in and opt-out groups. This helps control the lifespan of emitters for various effects. For example, in a scenario where penetration through the object isn't instant but slower, you want the effect to continue for a while. This can be easily achieved by adjusting this parameter. The value is specified in frames and initial set to 1. The next parameter, fragmented geometry, is used when dealing with fragmented geometry, as the name suggests. I will demonstrate this with an example. Enabling this toggle allows you to exclude internal polygons, the polygons between fragments, from the ricochet calculations. There is also a present with an additional setting to exclude these internal polygons until the distance between them becomes significant, preventing any effect from being applied to them. This means that points in the op-in and op-out groups for each fragment through which a moving point has passed won't create any effects. Effects will only be created on the outer polygons of the main object while it is still intact. This helps to avoid unnecessary calculations and keep the visualization clean. Once the object starts to break apart, the internal polygons between fragments also react and show ricochet effect and other impacts. Enabling this parameter also helps to prevent many errors when working with RBD simulations, where fragments might intersect and polygons can overlap. The next parameter is pieces scaling, which slightly distances the fragments from each other. When using fragment geometry, this helps the asset detect collisions more easily. When polygon R is the same position, the intersectal function might still produce errors. Rechecking its value multiple times increases the asset load and the overall computational burden. By slightly scaling down each fragment, the distance between polygons become uneven, making it easy for intersect all to determine the number of the position of intersection. This scaling is not done with the explode node, but through small pieces of VEX code that reduce each fragment size. This ensures that polygons are not in the same position, simplifying the intersection calculations and reducing the computational load. The distance adjustment occurs at a very low value, which you can tweak if necessary. In practice and testing, even a very small value is sufficient for the function to work correctly, without requiring excessive time for the calculation and result verification. The next parameter is onHit attribute. It allows you to adjust the force while the point is moving. I will explain this in more detail when we get to the velocity tab, but here is a brief overview. As the point moves through the asset, it creates a long trail of points with a velocity attribute. This attribute facilitates interaction between the asset and RBD simulations, flip simulations, or other types of simulations. The trail continuously follows the point. For example, if you have an object like a vase with a small weight and a moving point passed nearby, the force radius from this trail could affect the object even without direct contact. This can be useful for simulating an impact wave that doesn't directly hit the object. You can disable this attribute to ensure that the trail always forms behind the moving point. If you enable this toggle, the rail that transmits force will only be created at the moment of collision and while the point is inside the object. This means that as long as the point is flying and hasn't collided, no force transmitting trail will be left behind. This prevents light objects nearby from being affected by the passing point. The next parameter, enable output point offset, adjusts the trajectory angle. I mentioned this earlier when discussing the asset capabilities. Now I will show you how it works with an example. Let's take a look at number 4. Let's set up another camera for a better view. The enable output point offset parameter enables a function that creates an angle trajectory when a point is behind a moving object, and a collision should logically occur between the previous and current frames. If the moving point's trajectory should intersect with the object, we can't place the entry points here because the point was already under the object in the previous frame. Therefore, a more realistic approach is to create an angled trajectory. You can control the exit point's position relative to the object's angle using the output point position parameter. By adjusting this, you can move the exit point lower if needed. This is useful when the moving point is not close to the object but rather far away, making it more realistic, so shift it down slightly. You can also adjust the entry point's position relative to the object's angle. A value of 1 is the maximum, indicating the moving point was in this position in the previous frame. However, this might not be realistic because the object is falling at a certain speed, and the moving points likely traveled some distance before colliding with the object. Therefore, you can set value that seem realistic for your scene. These parameters are available for individual adjustment. The stop points parameter activates a function that stops points. Currently, point move indefinitely, colliding with the object but continuing their motion until the timeline ends. Enabling this parameter, assign a special attribute to each point, as shown here, with a value specified in this parameter. As the point moves, it calculates the distance it was traveled within any object. For example, if there is an object 20 meters wide, followed by an object 2 meters wide, and then one 10 meters wide, and the point stop value is set to 23 meters. The point will traverse the first two objects and stop inside the third object after traveling 1 meter into it. This acts as a countdown timer, tracking the distance the point was moved through all object along its trajectory. Once a point stops inside an object, it fully inherits the object's transformations. The points doesn't not have the attributes or groups of an exit point, so it is not used for reading effects like the exit points will be, as it remains inside the object. There is also an option to remove it from the simulation, although this functionality might not be available in this current version. I might add it in the next version. The use target points attribute parameter, when enabled, allows the asset to read this attribute from incoming points. This attribute can be created using an additional asset and is enabled here. Distance to stop is a default parameter for all newly created points, but can be individually adjusted, providing flexibility. If the toggle is enabled and points with the delim attribute are provided, this attribute's value can be individually set for each point. One of your points might travel a meter, while another might get stuck almost intermediately. This can be important depending on used scene settings. For now, let's disable this parameter. Let's run the simulation and see how it works. You can see that the points pass through the object and still have some distance left, so they don't stop. Let's reduce the distance to 0.25. Now we see that after traveling 0.25 meters within the object, the points stop. There is also a random function. Enabling it allowed you to set a minimum and maximum offset from the special value. This isn't a typical random function where you might set 0.2, meaning positive 0.2 and negative 0.2 from the value. Here you set specific value from negative and positive offset. For example, if we want a point to travel no more than 0.25 meters, but with some randomness, set the maximum offset to 0 and the minimum to 0.2. This way, the maximum distance a point can travel is 0.2. The minimum distance is what you set in the parameter. If you then set the value to 0.8 and want the minimum distance to be 0.25, set the minimum offset to 0. There will be no negative offset, so the random range will be between 0.25 and 0.33. Reload the simulation and you'll see that the minimum value is 0.25 and the random range is between 0.25 and 0.33. If the result seems off, check the value you entered. Ensure it's 0.08, not 0.8. How you can see that the minimum value is 0.25 and the random range correctly spans from 0.25 to 0.33. These are the main parameters in the Setup tab. There is also a Simulation tab, which contains standard settings for the subsolver embedded in the asset. This handles part of the process. In this tab, you'll find Start Frame and Substeps. Start Frame. This defines the frame at which the asset's simulation begins. Substeps. These are substeps related to the subsolver. If you worked with the subsolver before, you might know that substeps don't always work as expected. For example, if you set substep to 2, a point which a speed of 1 will travel a distance of 2 in one frame instead of 1. My asset correct this. Here substep work in the classical sense. In a point has a speed 1 and you set substeps to 4, there will be 4 substeps, each covering a distance of 0.25. Therefore, remember that in this asset, substep functionality as they typical doing simulations. Let's go to emitter tabs. The emitter tab allows you to create point if you don't have any incoming points. Enable adding points. You can visualize the points you create using the fifth output of the asset. To create a point, add an add node and create a point in it. Copy the parameter from the node and set it to create a point. Visualize it and move the point using the handle. For example, place the emitter point whatever you need. You can move the point around as needed. The emitter point will be set up here. Next, you can move to the Target tab. Enable adding points here as well. Add another point using the Add node. Copy the parameter to place a point. This method shows how you can set points without using the additional asset. Move the point to your desired location and then run the asset. With the start frame set to 1, the point will start moving from the first frame. Let's verify this. Since we set the distance to 0.25 in the Setup tab, the point stops inside the object after traveling 0.25. The movement happens from point A to point B from the points we set. The start point is here and the target point is here. If you prefer to set the emitter point and target point this way, you can use the built-in function of the asset for this purpose. Each tab includes a sort parameter. This toggle enables point sorting, which is useful in the target points tab. For example, if you input a pattern, you might want the proceed logically pattern that randomly. For example, if the pattern is a spiral, you want the movement to follow a special logic. You can define this logic using the sort tab, similar to how you would use the regular sort sub node. This allows to you sort points in various ways. The same applies to the emitter tab. If you need to sort emitter points, you can enable the toggle and sort incoming points and target points as needed. Additionally, in the target tab, there is a parameter called start position attribute. This parameter is linked to the direction correction of an additional asset and works as follows. Sometimes, if an emitter point moves very quickly and you set target points, they might not be placed in the exact frame you want. If you have a powerful computer, this issue might not be noticeable, but I created a toggle that generates an additional vector attribute with the emitter position at the moment of point creation. Let's reset the necessary points and create a point here. Since the asset is not connected, we can't see it yet. Now we'll create a point here. You'll notice that the point now has a target position and a start position. Enabling the start position attribute toggle in the asset tells the asset to read the vector attribute with the emitter point's position from the incoming point. This attribute is called start pos. Let me show you the name. You can set it manually if you don't use an additional asset and create points using a wrangle or another methods. You can simply create a start pos attribute, add the emitter points position to it, and enable the toggle in the targets tab. The asset will then use this attribute to start the points movement from the special position. This method ensures that your points start from the correct positions, even if they are created dynamically or through custom commands. Let's remove the unnecessary elements. We'll reset the simulation and remove the points, since we don't need them anymore. We also don't need direction correction. Now let's move to the next tab, Explode. This tab is used to create special points at the moment of collision, which will then be used as emitters for explosions. To start creating points for explosion emitters, you need to enable the Enable Explode Mode toggle. Enabling this toggle activates several parameters. The first parameter is group, the name of the group to which the point is added at the moment of collision. The distance to explosion parameter determines the offset of the created point's position relative to the collision position along the point's trajectory. If the value is positive, the offset will be into the object. If the value is negative, the offset will be out of the object. Let's see how this works. We'll set a large value, select the asset, reset the points, and run the simulation. We should have set a higher speed for quicker result. Now we can see that an effect has occurred. Let's take a close look. Here we can observe that the explosion sources are added at a certain distance from the collision position. We can also see that the fragments are flying in the direction of the force vectors from the explosion source. An additional effect is visible here. This piece was initially hit by the moving point. In the next frame, when the explosion source is added, the force from the explosion and its vectors act on this piece. This looks realistic and logical. Overall, this feature allows from the realistic simulation of explosion by adding emitter points at precise collision moment and positions. Let's make this value negative and see the difference. We'll run the same simulation again and observe that this time the explosion source is added at a position offset in the opposite direction of the collision along the trajectory by the given value. Let's set it even lower, say minus 0.2, to start the simulation. Now we can see that the explosion source is added almost inside the object. Consequently, the force vectors act from the inside, causing the fragments to scatter in all directions. The next parameter, explode delay, determines how many frames after the collision the point will be added to the group specified in the group parameter. In other words, it's the delay before the explosion source is added. By default, it is that auto 1, meaning the source is added at the moment of collision. Let's set this value to 4 and restart the simulation. Now we can see that some time pass after the collision, as specified by this parameter before the explosion source is added. Turn off the creation of explosion source points and move on to the next tab. The Ricochet tab contains parameters that control the ricochet of polygons when a point collides with a polygon whose plane angle relative to the point's trajectory is sharp enough. This works as an option. You can enable or disable the ricochet calculation using the Enable Ricochet toggle. The rebound angle threshold parameters set the minimum obtuse angle relative to the polygon's plane. Values range from 19 to 118 degrees. The logic is as follows. If the parameter is set to 19 degrees, the ricochet will occur of polygons perpendicular to the point's trajectory. If the values is close to 118, for example 179 or 178, the ricochet will happen rarely. Since we're talking about VFX and not precise physical simulation of real ricochets, my observations suggest that the most effective and visual appealing ricochets occur with the 165 to 175 range. When calculating the ricochet trajectory, a certain randomization is applied. The rebound angle mean and rebound angle max parameters set the minimum and maximum values for this randomization. Let's demonstrate this with an example. Go back to the Ricochet tab and change the values of these parameters. They define the minimum and maximum angles for calculation the ricochet trajectory. The next parameter, group removal delay, determines how long a point will remain in the special RigPT group before being removed. The default value is 1 frame. I use this group to attach effect at the point where ricochet has occurred. This is convenient because it separates the effect from point where collision has happened without a ricochet. Using this special group makes it easy to automate adding effect specifically for ricochet points. The next toggle enables the calculation of the ricochet trajectory and also check the object involved in the trajectory calculation for a special attribute. If this special attribute is found on the object, they will be excluded from the ricochet trajectory calculation. This is useful for objects like a paper or fabric, which should not be considered for ricochet calculations. It can also apply to material like rubber, plastic, or wood, anything you need to exclude from the ricochet trajectory calculation. The attribute name and attribute value parameters specify the name and value of the attribute that will be checked to exclude object from the ricochet calculation. At the beginning of the tutorial, I showed an example of how this works when I discussed the asset capabilities. I won't repeat the visual example here to save time. I hope everything is clear. Now, let's move on to the Trails tab. Let's change the geometry for this example. We'll use something that will clearly show the trails. Let's take a look here. Simulate again. We have one trail here. Why only one? Oh yeah, the stop points are enabled, so it stops. Now we have two trails. We'll use them to explain the parameters. The first parameter is attribute name. This is the name of the attribute that will contain a unique value for each trail primitive. Let's go here. The name was trail, and here it is. We can see that each of these primitives has a unique value. You can use this, separate them, and apply different effect to each trail. The next parameter is transform matrix delay. Its function is similar to the transform matrix delay for incoming and outgoing points. Essentially, it delays the application of the transformation matrix to these primitives. By default, it has a value of 1 and is applied almost immediately in the next frame. Next, there are a number of parameters similar to those in the pop source node in DOP simulation for particles. This similarity is due to the fact that the points generating these trails are created using a DOP network particle simulation within the asset. The setting here corresponds to the source setting for these particles, including bird attributes and other properties that can be transferred. Additionally, there is a smooth tab, which functions like the smooth top node. It smooths the geometry of these primitives so they don't appear as rigid or square along the point trajectory. In the smooth tab, you can set the same parameters as in the smooth top node, such as strange and filtering to achieve the desired level of smoothness for the trails. I hope this is clear. Increasing the parameters will make the geometry of these trails smoother. I don't think it's necessary to visualize this example right now, so let's move on to the velocity tab. The velocity tab contains parameters mainly used for interacting with simulations. Let's change the geometry for this example. Select a different camera. The third one should be fine. And increase the speed. Reset the points. Remember, points are reset on the additional asset only when it is selected in the network view. Let's set a point and use it as an example for explaining the velocity tab. This asset can interact with various simulations by passing a vector attribute velocity to them. The attribute is added to point created at the moment a moving point collides with polygonal object. You can see this here at the third output of the asset. A line of points with the velocity vector attribute is created. Points are not created when there is no collision because the onHit attribute toggle in the Setup tab is enabled. If this toggle were off, points will be created on every frame. Once a collision occurs and points are created, they are imported into the DOP network through object merge into the RBD simulation. In this simulation, a small setup I created converts the velocity vector attribute into a force that influences the simulation. In the example provided, a geometry wrangle is used. I might replace it with a geometry warp In the example I give you because I found it more convenient and it allows for RAM-based force control. Nevertheless, I'll explain how it works with the geometry evolve. Here's how it works. On each frame, the setup searches for points created by the asset within a specified distance. If a point is found, close the fragment packet pieces in the rigid body solver. The velocity attribute is copied from it and converted into a force. The copying is done with interpolation based on the distance data. The closer the point is to the point created by the asset, the greater the force applied. You can modify this logic using the provided parameters: minimum search distance, maximum search distance, and minimum and maximum interpolation values. This effectively remaps the distance. Additionally, there is a force multiplier parameter, which is a multiplier for the resulting force. Let's try changing some of these parameters to see their effects. We'll increase the force, set the distance to 0.4 and the interpolation to 0.2. Let's start the simulation and observe. As you can see, previously a small pieces has attached, but now a much larger path is influenced. The force vector appears again, just like before, but this time it shows up twice because there is a single direct collision with the fragments that have already been injected. As we can see, the force value and its impact have changed. I will revert to the previous value since I preferred how it looked with the default settings. These parameters, along with the setting I mentioned earlier for transferring the velocity vector attribute into a force within the simulation, allow for flexible adjustment of the force's impact on the object. You can control not only the radius and range of the force, but also the direction and area of influence. Let me show you how to use these features. The first parameter is toggle velocity template visualization. As the name suggests, it enables the visualization of the velocity template. The first parameter here is template position. This sets the position for the velocity template. If you need to position it somewhere specific, you can set the point's position and the velocity template will move there instead of starting at the origin. Currently, it appears at the origin. Template multiplier is a multiplier for the vector velocity. For example, if you want the vector to be more visible, you can increase their size. This does not affect the simulation or the asset's impact on the simulation. These values only apply within the template for better visualization. Remember to turn off toggle velocity template visualization after adjusting the velocity template. If left on, the line of points with velocity vectors will appear at the origin or the specific position every frames. If there is geometry is that spot being processed by the set, it might be moved. By default, the velocity vector forms a spiral shape. This isn't because most projectiles spin in flight. It's because a spiral shape creates an interesting spread pattern for fragments. This also looks good in flip simulations when a moving point enters a flip pool, leaving a vortex-like trail. For flip simulations, shorter lines are preferable, not extending to the full velocity value. I might have been better to create an interpolation from the endpoint of the line to the moving point, interpolating the velocity vector. This would base it on the speed value, so the endpoint in the line has the minimum velocity vector value and the point closest to the moving point has the maximum value speed. This would create a relatively universal formula to interpolate the speed parameter value for each point. However, I haven't implemented this in the current version of the asset, how as many other features. For now, the parameter settings are provided for user adjustment. The first parameter for configuring velocity vectors is velocity multiplier, which simply scales the velocity. Number of points set the how many of points in the line. Segment length determines the distance between points. For example, if we set this to 0.1, the points will be closer together, increasing their frequency. If we set it to 1, the frequency decreases, and points are placed farther apart. Since the number of points is based on the velocity value in the additional asset, and it divides by the segment length, the total length of the line remains constant. This length is equal to the distance the point travels in one frame, essentially the velocity value. If we remove the expression and set the length manually, we can control the length of the line ourselves. For example, let's set it to 15 points with a small segment length. You'll see a shorter line with points placed frequently. To have fewer points at the same frequency, we reduce the number of points. To maintain the frequency or the line length, adjust these parameters accordingly to keep it mathematically correct. These two parameters allow you to control the number of points and the line's length. The next parameter is rotation angle, which is the rotation angle around the trajectory of the moving point. You can set it to any value. If set to 0, all velocity vectors will point in the same direction, causing all fragments of a colliding geometry to move in the same direction. I recommend using spiral shape as they usually produce interesting results. Tilt angle is the angle of deviation from the moving point's trajectory. You can adjust it to be very sharp or the opposite direction. In case of a collision with fragment geometry, the fragment will move in the opposite direction to the point's movement. I recommend keeping the default setting. Through the testing, I found these parameters to be optimal for various scenarios. If you need something unique, experiment with this setting to find what works best for you. Next is the rebound velocity multiplier parameter. This is a separate multiplier for cases where a rebound occurs from a polygon. The toggle velocity in the direction of rebound parameter reverses the direction of the force. Let me show you how this works with an example. When a collision rebound are detected, the velocity vector and the line drawn from the point of rebound are directed along the moving point's trajectory up to the collision point. This results in an effect where the impact causes pieces to break off from the wall. By default, this effect works unintended. However, if you want piece to be pulled out from the wall, enable toggle velocity in the direction of rebound. Reset the simulation and run it again. Now we see that the velocity vectors are aligned in the direction of the rebound trajectory. This means that the fragments follow the new trajectory after the rebound. Sometimes this effect looks more appealing than a simple impact against the wall. You can toggle this parameter on or off to control the direction. If you don't want the force to affect the rebound point, set the multiplier to 0, and no force will be applied at these points. That covers the asset parameters. As a final example of how velocity works in simulation and beyond, we need to reset the rotation angle, set the camera, and reset the points. I also added a new parameter to the additional asset. To see it, we need to toggle this setting on and off and start interacting with the simulation. For instance, let's break off a piece from the wall. You can interact with all the fallen parts because the asset works with the result of the RBD simulation and send the velocity vectors attribute, which is then converted into force and applied to the simulation results. This creates a king of recursion, actually, pseudo-recursion. There is no real recursion here. The timing is just very short, making it look like real-time processing. If you like the scene or the shot, you can cache it. If you want to refine something, for example adding more points if they run out, you can do so. Choose the camera and run the simulation again. Here, it restarted but it usually continues looping. You can add points to the existing ones, making changes on top of the previous iteration's simulation. This means you can modify the ongoing simulation in the resimulation process. Once the simulation completes, it loads with both the initial and newly added changes. Each iteration updates on top of the previous one, creating a continuous simulation loop. Note that it's always a new simulation rather than a replay of the same day because the points follow the same trajectories and the RBD solver parameters remain unchanged. This gives the appearance of a consistent simulation. Here you can notice that sometimes rebounds occur. If you select a specified filter, it will be more clearly visible. Let's also add numbering for the points. Not for all points, only for those that are moving. Occasionally, points hit fragments whose angles that specified in the ricochet up and bounce off. By adjusting the angles, you can achieve more impressive effects. If you need this for your scene, you can always tweak it further, ever on top of the simulation. You can change the angle of existing trajectories, but this will slightly after the simulation. For example, let's set the rebound angle to an extreme 125 and restart the simulation. It may not reset intermittently, but now you see more points bouncing off the angles. Previously, there were fewer such rebounds. This shows that even after creating the initial points trajectories, you can modify them during resimulation using these parameters. This can also look interesting when viewing only the trails. Let's hide everything else and focus on the trails. You'll see an interesting pattern where each fragment leaves a trail as it moves. If these fragments are grouped, the trails will reflect that. Watching these trails transform based on the fragment's path can be quite engaging. Sometimes they form complex structures when they fall apart, which can look fascinating. Let's run a different simulation. Select a point. Sometimes the RBD solver might glitch, requiring a reset. Oh, it's not the RBD solver, it's my mistake. Reset the points and start the simulation again. Now the picture might be more interesting. The foundation can be broken because it's inactive for this wall. The maximum effect we can achieve here is a scattered mess. You'll see that all collisions are calculated accurately without issues. Let's restart. You can also view this with polygons. Sometimes it looks better this way, especially if you isolate and color the trails. It becomes clearer where everything is. For convenience, let's display only the trails. Now let's resimulate everything. If no parts are displayed, the RBD solver won't render in the viewport, making it unavailable for interaction. This means the simulation object won't load into the Simshot for further processing. We see a lot of trails in various fragments because the points lack a stop attribute. Without the stop attribute, points continue along their trajectory, leaving a trail in every fragment they pass through. Now that the simulation has fully loaded, let's look at it through the trails. There are a pile of details, each with a unique attribute value. You can use this value to isolate any trails and perform additional operations on it. All these points, or rather all these trails, have entry and exit points for each fragment, which can also be identified. For example, you can see here the entry and exit points that appear. Using numbering might be too much, but as you can see, these points can have specific effect attached to them. The purpose of this asset is to quickly create these points and polygon lines so you can easily attach necessary effects directly to this geometry. Additionally, it helps automate the calculation process for mechanics is in scene involving shots or other moving parts that need to leave trails for further interaction. You can also track the production of each moving points individually. As a point moves through the simulation, colliding with objects and leaving entry exit points and trails. It records its ID in special attribute values. Let me show you an example. Let's rotate the test geometry by 19 degrees to create more collisions. We'll remove unnecessary points, leaving just 2. Reset the points and select the asset directly. The reset button won't work if the additional HDA in the viewport is not selected. Now we see both points interacting with the simulation. Let's look at all points, expand the view to see the difference. The top 2 points are thus moving through the simulation by the asset. They have a set of attributes not found in point created on objects. For example, they lack the cure frame attribute, creation frame, but have speed attribute. Generally, they differ in the attributes they pose compared to created points. You can notice that the entry and exit points also have an ID attribute. If we scroll down, we see points from the second to the 45 created by the first moving points with its ID recorder. Below all created points have an ID of 1, indicating the second moving point created them. You can use the blast node to, for example, delete all points created by a specific moving point or isolate them. The same applies to trails. Trails points have a name trail attribute, the second value of which is the ID of the point that created the trail. For example, we see 0 here, and further down it changed to 1. This allows you to track the entire path of a point through the simulation and see how many objects it was interacted with. Now I will show you how I use the assets output to apply effect emitters. I call these presets. They are a set of nodes and a setting for automatically adding effects to points. Since the video is already getting quite long, I'll create a separate video on how I use the asset in a real scene. Let's start with adding smoke. I will quickly set up the scene, reset the simulation and set a standard geometry orientation, add a camera and enable smoke display. The scene is set up quite quickly. Let's remove the extra points and leave about 20. Now we can start. I'll place the points randomly. This smoke examples is quite primitive and low resolution, mainly to show how it works. This smoke is added automatically. As you can see, there are no collisions, so the image might look a bit odd. Note that there are no collisions and it's low resolution. There is some preset turbulence and shape, but it is a simple example. You can make it more detailed and still add it automatically. The settings for creating effect emitters are quite universal for many simulated effects. The base for creating effect emitters with the necessary attributes is used almost everywhere. However, the effects themselves can vary widely, depending on the simulation you use, whether it's particle simulation or something else. This important part is how the emitters are prepared for applying these effects. Let's make a simple example with fewer points for clarity. Remove the extra points, reset the asset. True, it wasn't necessary, but just in case. And place a point here and another one over there to create some variation in collision times. Switch to the object where the smoke is created and I'll explain everything step by step. Starting with the instant geometry, it's a part of a sphere. It differs for entry and exit points. For exit points, it remains whole. For entry points, a small part is cut out using the height parameter in this node. The nodes are identical for both entry and exit points, but I don't cut out this part for exit points because it's fine for effect vector to be directed along or according to the moving point's trajectory. If you don't cut out this part for entry points, the effect will spread in the opposite direction of the trajectory, which isn't ideal. But cutting out this part, the velocity vector are directed to the sides. You can also adjust the angle. If needed, you can adjust the angle direction for the velocity vector. Setting these values to the minimum negative values will make the effect projected until its geometry have a narrow direction, mostly against the moving point's trajectory. If you set higher values, for example like this, and for reduce the height, leaving just this small geometry, then if an entry point collides with an object surface, the effect will distribute along the surface. Especially when using smoke in this case, if there are collisions with this object, the smoke will also distribute along the surface instead of against the trajectory, which look more natural. This is why I create this node to control height and angle. Next, using the scatter node, points are added to this geometry in a relative random order. Different counts are set to exit and entry points, meaning different numbers of points are added. This parameter can of course be adjusted. You can add many points or just a few, depending on what the scene requires. Then noise is added to both position and velocity in the attribute VOP. It's all pretty standard, with remapping, multiplication, and addition, which I am sure you understand. All the main parameters are brought outside the node. Noise is added, which gives it a crazy look because the velocity multiplier parameter has a fiery height value, making the vector long and pronounced. Next, a similar noise is added to both position and velocity to make it look more natural. I have a transform node because I cut out a piece of the sphere and I'm using it without changing its orientation. I adjust in with the transform node to the required orientation, which the instanced geometry, or rather the point created on it, will copy via the copy to points node to the points produced by the asset, specifically in the group called OpIn RigPT. RigPT is the group where the rebound points are placed, so only incoming and rebound points are added in this branch. The same process happens in the neighboring branch, where only exit points are added. For them, the instance geometry is different, or the points align with it as part of the sphere without any cuts. Then, after the points are added to geometry, let's see how this happens. To do this, we need to switch here. Select this mode to make it clearer. You see at the moment of collision where its occur points are added over rail on the instanced geometry which have this velocity attribute. I will vary slightly each time within the noise because the noise depends on position and naturally it will have different values. This is logic because effects should be standardized yet differ from each other. They should be unique and vary. You know, Houdini makes it easy to do this since it doesn't use point numbers. True, it could have used point numbers. It uses positions, so the noise will always be within the set parameters, but it will always be different. Then, in the branch related to incoming points and rebound points, there is also a special node where an additional direction is set to the existing velocity vectors. This direction is applied to all incoming points. It's a rebound angle, even in case where no rebound occurs, like when there is a collision with an inclined object. Let's see this in action. I went too far. Let's rewind. Let's just focus on ricochet, not a 19 degrees angle. Let's go with 17 instead. Let's adjust the point here again. Now let's see, maybe some points will fly there and there. No effect at all. Strange, why is there no effect? Maybe the RBD solver didn't reset? I keep rewinding all the time. Because in this regard, Houdini is a bit crazy. When you set the first frame and then need to move somewhere in the network view, I don't know, maybe it's my personal opinion, but for some reason the scroll intermittently jumped to this last frame and everything starts to lag. Then the necessary timeline calculation begins. So let's reset all the points, put a new one. Let's go into, well, we can stay here. Let's take a closer look. Yes, I am better, maybe, well, let's leave it so that the vectors are visible. We see that this vector appears here. It's very strange why. Oh yeah, because we haven't selected this node yet. Here we can set a certain direction toward the rebound. That is, when we have an effect, it's currently going against the rebound. Yes, when we have some effect here, mainly smoke will be emitted there. Now let's make it stronger. I'll demonstrate it to you along with the solver's operation, like this. Where's the smoke? Oh, the smoke is here. The smoke is visible only like this. It turned out very weak for some reason. But if you look closely, it's because I have a low density. If you look closely, there is indeed a direction toward the departure. See? I'll show you the Simshot. Reset the dop sim and try again. However, here is already visible that there is indeed a direction. The same things can be done with any effects, whether it's sparks, some debris that you can draw with particle, and here, and whatever your imagination allows. The next step is resetting the addition of points produced by the asset. They are added through the object merge node. Then, depending on your scenario, Whether you're using fragmented geometry or not, you can either directly set it to 0 here, run the geometry, or you can path 1, and then the incoming points will pass through this node. It is with this node that points between pieces are removed, and they do not serve as emitters for any effect. Deletion occurs according to the following principle. Simply the distance between points is taken, and when the distance is small, these points are not supplied further for copying their geometry. It's a pretty straightforward setting. However, it allows you to avoid creating points on pieces while they are close to each other. Ideally, logically, this parameter should correspond to the piece's scaling parameter in the asset, or slightly exceed it. I usually set this value much larger because if there are non-close-ups, even if there are close-ups, typically for highlighting of emitters on pieces is required while they are still close to each other. The distance should be really quite large for it to make sense, essentially if you don't have any close-ups. This can be completely avoided. It will necessary calculations, add a considerable amount of time to the simulation, and won't really affect the picture and even worse than it. For it to look natural, it's desirable for the distance to be quite large, so that the large functions fall away directly, or the pieces are at a sufficiently large distance for it to look natural. Therefore, sorry, I set the parameter value significantly higher than the piece's scaling parameter. Well, and I adjust it overall by eye, depending on the scene's requirements, taking into account optimization and resource conservation. The parameter value of threshold is the distance beyond which points become active for adding emitters to them. Next comes a wrangle node that additionally controls the presence of points in group onto which geometry is added. Here, it's not used within the context of working with smoke. In other preset, it's used additionally to extend the duration of some effect beyond what is specified in the asset. This function is also performed by the asset, so in this case, without using any timing other than this of the asset, we can simply turn off this node. But it's also present in the smoke preset so that you can use it separately. For example, if you have smoke and the smoke should only be emitted in the first frame and there is also a burning effect, and the emitter for the fuel should appear, let's say, on frame 3. Then here you can specify a different value. Here it's directly related to the asset, just duplicate it. But you can specify your own value. If there is a preset for fire here, behind it will be pyro, where fire will be generated, or it will be a soap node. You just set your timings and set smoke will be emitted only for one frame, since it works in a separate preset. And in a separate preset, if you set the value here, for example 3 for fire, then the fire will be emitted for 3 frames. This is like an additional control over the presence over time of points in group. Sometimes this is required and such an option is available. The next node is peak. It's necessary to slightly offset the position of the point until which the geometry will be copied related to its original position. This is done if, for example, you want to use VDB as a collision for geometry, not just to create smoke to be emitted but also to react to fallen pieces, to a breaking wall, and so on. to prevent collision from occurring in the first frame so that the emitter doesn't end up inside the VDB. Or you don't have to use a very high resolution VDB and save computational resources on it. You can move the source away from the position for copying the emitter effects to it by a certain distance so that at the moment of calculation during the simulation it ends up outside our VDB and doesn't participate in the collision in the first frame. After the asset supplies points to the object merge, they are processed here and sent to geometry copying. Emitters are copied onto them. All of this is fed, in this case, into power source where density and temperature parameter are formed. Then it's fed into volume rasterized attribute node, and after that, it's sent into the DOP network. You can put some SOAP node here and conduct the simulation in a SOAP node. It's not necessary to use the DOP network. And actually, then you already see the output of the simulation result. That's how the preset is arranged. There are slightly more complex scenarios. Now I'll show you an example with sparks. They are practically no different from this preset. A simple additional branch is added here, right here. This is also a group filter, but with a different timing. The timing here also has some randomness. This is done so that in the first frame, when some collision occurs, sparks with high velocity are emitted and scattered in different directions. And after that, for a certain amount of time, from 24 40 frames, a small number of sparks are emitted. They don't have such a high velocity, and the sparks simply fall down. There is practically no velocity there. They create the effect of dripping molten metal. This can also be used for fire, for some other effects. That is, in the first frame, the main action occurs. For example, smoke is emitted when a collision occurs, and then, for a certain number of frames, burning occurs, for instance. That is, fuel for the fire is emitted, and this processing occurs further in the solver. You can simply copy the group filter node, set separate timings for it, and run it in a separate copy to points and feed it into the simulation to create a separate pop source, as well as have its own parameters for the number of particles generated, strength, and so on. That is, the settings are basically identical to the previous preset. They slightly differ in that an additional branch is added here. I hope it was clear how to add effect to point produced by the asset. Next, let's consider the setting of the next preset, which allows adding explosion emitters to points. To do this, let's return to the scene. A normal state suitable for the explode tab. Let's enable explode mode. Just in case, reset the simulation and see how it looks. So the preset with the settings is in the geometry called SimExplode. It's quite small and works as follows. Points produced by the asset are fetched through the node object merge. Then, in blast node, all points not in the group are removed. The special group, which you see here, simply links to the emitter in this case. It's called blow, just like it's called in the asset. In the example files there are quite a few, probably there will be a reference link. If you copy and paste your own scene for here, keep in mind that they need to be replaced. Here is you need to specify the name of the group indicating the asset parameter. So, next the data goes down to the wrangle where the seed is formed. which I previously used in Pyroburst source to make the explosion source more random. Then the next node, also a wrangle, in which the initial frame is formed. It's formed as an attribute for the Pyro solver, so that the Pyro solver doesn't work idle in vain. And it starts only when some event has already occurred. That is, when an explosion source has already been added. By the attribute you can always see in these files, it always has a +5 frames. Always +5 frames to the current frame, until some event has occurred, until an explosion source has been added, just to save resources and unnecessary calculations so as not to do them. Next, the data goes into a for each loop, where also for each point its own starting frame is created, which is then sent to the Pyro source. Here you can see it. Yes, here it is. Start frame. It's individual for each point. There is a feature here. If you take out this node from here and don't use in the loop, it will also work. But if you put the points, for example, according to the following scheme, that is, put 2 in the first frame, in the second frame put 3 somewhere nearby, and when the points reach the wall. Suppose they intermediately reached it in the first frame, thus that we put in the first frame intermediately reached it in the second frame, arrived at it in the second. Accordingly, when explosion sources are added to this node, the initial frame is sent to it. If, for example, a delay is set to 3 seconds, the explosion source is added within 3 seconds, then initially the force that will be contained in this. In the first added source, in the first frame of these 2 points that we put, it will be quite strong, and all the source that will be added after that will have this force within 3 seconds. That is, they will also work for 3 seconds, but their reaction will be much weaker. Therefore, I recommend using the preset in general, such that adding an explosion source occurs in a loop. Next, the data exits the loop, based on which a volume is created, which is then fed into the Pyro source, where the visual calculation of the explosion itself takes place. Here you can adjust it. You can use the dot network for this if it's more convenient for you, or use Hou.Tutorials. You'll simply have a source for the volume. Also, after the loop, the data is outputted with all attributes except velocity removed. They are exported to the dot network. Here, in this object merge, they are also fed into the dot network to influence the RBD simulation. Inside the dot network, the transfer of force is handled by a geometry wrangle named velocity explode. It works the same way as the geometry walk. I explained the principle of its separation when I talked about the velocity tab. Here you can make simply more custom settings. Here there is a ramp that allows you to more precisely adjust the force's influence. Everything happens the same way. The explosion sources are randomized, and the explosion duration parameter controls the duration of the explosion. Let's turn off the explosions for now. We won't need them anymore at the moment. Next, let's consider the group of settings that use trails. These are primitives created by the asset inside object that repeat the trajectory of a point's movement within these objects. I use them to create whole geometry. Let me show you what it looks like. Let's add a few more points. You need to be quiet. The main of resources, so it lags a bit. Unfortunately, my computer is far from the most powerful. You can get such an interesting combined effect. You see, on all the pieces that fall off, there are also holes left. It's of course not realistic enough, but it's look good. That is, there's an opportunity to affect the fragments themselves. The fragmented geometry that is to cause some destruction to break these constraints that hold them and still leave holes. Sometimes it looks quite nice, despite to being very realistic probably. However, it's much more realistic than when an object flies through a wall and partly breaks it. For example, a piece flies out here, and from this side, it's just starting to fall out. It's absolutely logical if there are some hole left. With this setting in place, using the settings of this Boolean geometry, you can adjust this effect. Let's take a closer look at them. Let's start with the not object merge, where the result of the dot simulation are imparted, or some sub geometry. The switch is set to the parameter in the asset. If you change the geometry in the asset, but unsub there, and here the switch also changes, and sub geometry is already used. In this case, we're working with fragmented pieces participating in the simulation, so here the output is set to 0. Accordingly, the data comes directly from the RBD simulation. Next in the wrangle is which pieces to work with Boolean are selected. This is necessary so that we don't have to calculate all the pieces fully. There are about 2000 of them here, so most of the pieces haven't collided. We have only 3 hits in local areas. There is no need for us to calculate each piece in this node. They are separated by this code and a special string attribute is added, which is read by the sub node split. Let's run the simulation now so that we have some collisions. The node split accordingly separates the pieces and outputs them for Boolean operation. That's quite enough. Here you can see that pieces have been added based on the name attribute, which need to be cut out. Let's see how it looks. Let's take other items from here. It looks like this. For some reason, our geometry is black. But you can see that only the pieces that interacted with the asset, only they are improved in the Boolean calculation. You see only thus where is necessary to leave a hole. This again helps save resources and simply speed up the process of creating such scene. In this node, there are 2 ways to separate these pieces. Rather, additional ways to separate pieces are enabled. Sometimes there is a situation when, now I'll turn on the moment so it's clearly visible. There is such a simulation when a piece is overlapped by another, and since there were no collisions in it, it consequently doesn't participate in the calculations. The initial part of the code is here. It implies working only with those pieces with which there was an intersection. And if you uncheck this checkbox, you see something like this. That there was no intersection with this piece, so the Boolean didn't work on it. It only worked with those pieces with which there was a direct intersection. Sometimes this is enough if the scene isn't close up and you don't need to show it. You just need to add a certain effect. In general, this also happens. Simply calculation will be faster. Not much faster, but faster. Of course, depending on how many pieces are improved and how close they are and at that radius you are doing this. Enabling toggle rad make it find pieces at a certain distance from the primitive. Accordingly, in the radius parameter, you set this distance. As I mentioned earlier, the pieces are separated into the snot split and go to the work with boolean. Also, boolean is fed this geometry. This is the same trail. In this node wrangle, increase the length. I increase the length. I increase the length of trails so that they differently extend beyond the boundaries of the pieces. Sometimes there are situations when there is a collision with a piece that's flying in a rather strange position, and it's cut out, as if not completely. Then you see that there are some angles, so if it's a close-up, you might see it. This parameter can be adjusted by increasing it so that there are situations like this. For example, such situations. You see where it didn't cut completely simply because the primitive created inside the object, of course, is created from the exit points to the entry points, which is right on the surface. And if we build the same geometry based on them, then it will fit under the surface. It will be nice to increase it a little, so I match such a node that allows you to increase their length and control this value. Next, I draw a sample trail. I add points to it. After sample I do polywire. Let's open all the other objects. As we can see, simply round geometry is added. Next, in node attribute swap, I add some noise so that it's not a smooth hole, but has certain irregularities. I set a normal to this structure, and I cut it out with boolean in a certain part along the trail. These settings allow processing geometry automatically. However, if you don't have a very powerful computer, despite the optimization, it may still require some resources from your hardware. Here also there is the export output of a special group containing only these internal primitives. See, I use them to apply various effects as well. For example, a glow effect. This data can also be used, for example, to scatter some points on them and attach some effects to these polygons, as they will also move along with the piece. Or if you need some large opening and need some floating mesh, you can also place some emitters for effects directly on the surface of these polygons. That is, as a separate export result of Boolean operations. In this video, I'll only talk about the glow effect, and I have made two versions of its implementation. The first version is the geometry output by the Boolean node. Since it was attribute with trails. And trails are created in the pop solver. It's actually a particle. They have age, life, so based on this, you can create a certain gradient, which is implemented here to gradually decrease the glow. All these parameters can be adjusted. Also by setting them in the setting in the trail as setup, or here, you can add separate speed for it to happen faster or slower. The second version allows more precisely add not the geometry output by the Boolean node. It simply add a trail polywire with some certain noise and based on the width attribute, which is created in the node in the wrangle color and width and also based on the age, life attributes. The radius of the geometry is adjusted, which also allows over time to decrease the radius of the geometry, that is, to decrease the geometry itself. Not only change the color by gradient, but also decrease the geometry itself. And for this, let's switch to another scene. Here is what the scene looks like. It's quite simple. Here is a grid with polyextrude and test geometry. From the test geometry in Wrangle, using the getPacketTransform function, the transformation matrix is taken and written to the detail attribute x form. Sorry, it's immediately written to the primitive. Then, in assembly node, an individual attribute is output for each closed geometry object. In back node, it is unpacking, and all this is fed into the third input of the asset. Here, accordingly, in the source, it said that this is subgeometry, because we're dealing not with the result of simulation, but with the animation. Almost all asset settings remained default. I only enabled toggle fragmented geometry. Here's also the same presets are used that I talked about and showed earlier. Here's for example Scorch, it's a glow. It's exactly the same. Here are also sparks. Of course, the boolean for cutting holes. And explosion, there is no smoke here. Let's work with what we have. Let's switch to the asset, choose an additional HDA, camera, and let's start setting points. Something like this. Next, I will do the same thing but add collision for sparks and calculate it with collisions. And send it to render. Here's how it's look with collision read and boolean. Naturally, these openings are visible. Somewhere such a trajectory was obtained. Now let's render it and see the result. This is the picture I got on the render. YouTube of course will eat up the small quality details of this video, but overall the picture turned out quite good. After all, we didn't spend so much time on it. Basically, a few minutes on copy-paste presets. Then setting the camera, setting points by clicking the mouse in the viewport in the places where would you like to get collisions and effect highlight, and starting production. That is, essentially, further steps involve animating with collisions, and this case sparks. I didn't animate the glow and the openings. They were considered as directed sparks animation and the render launch. And those are all openings to get such a picture. Here is this video, by the way, you can clearly see the openings. In one of the frames, if you look closely in this area, you can clearly see that's indeed a true hole. There is some internal structure that glows. Not just a cycle attached to a polygon, glowing. But it's indeed a change in geometry that can also be controlled. That is, you can change this internal structure, apply your own effect there, refine it somehow. Here is also there are bounces. They may not have been immediately noticeable in the video. Here's just the first trajectory. See, it changes, and after it hits some objects, Somewhere there was a bounce, maybe a wing on its back, from which it bounced off and went aside. See all the other flies traced. Here's another one. Here is some part hits the side and flies off to the side as well. This can also of course be controlled just by setting the necessary angles. If you won't need bounces at all, you can turn them off completely, or somehow adjust them. But with default settings, it's slightly liven up the picture and make it a bit more interesting. This concludes the Simshot operation tutorial. I have listed the main application methods. I will tell you about some interesting features in the next video, if of course there will be an opportunity to continue releasing them. If you have any questions, ideas or suggestions or interesting work, please write to me. I'll also attach a link in the video description to my personal website, where all my available contacts are listed. I hope this tool will be useful to someone and will help create many cool scenes, or lift you spirits if you are using it just for fun. In my opinion, it's much better to shoot and destroy in computer simulation than in real life. Thanks for your attention to everyone who managed to listen to the end. Good luck in your creativity.